Hello and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we'll continue our readings from The View from the Stars, an anthology of science fiction by Walter M. Miller, Jr. Big Joe and the Nth Generation. A thief, he was about to die like a thief. He hung from the post by his wrists. The wan sunlight glistened faintly on his naked back as he waited, eyes tightly closed, lips moving slowly as he pressed his face against the rough wood and stood on tiptoe to relieve the growing ache in his shoulders. When his ankles ached, he hung by the nails that pierced his forearms just above the wrists. He was young, perhaps in his 10th Mars year, and his crisp black hair was close cropped in the fashion of the bachelor who has not yet sired a pup, or not yet admitted he has. Lithe and sleek, with the quick knotty muscles and slender rawhide limbs of a wild thing, half-fed and hungry with a quick furious hunger that crouched in ambush. His face, though twisted with pain and fright, remained that of a cocky pup. When he opened his eyes, he could see the low hills of Mars, sun-washed and gray-green with trees, trees brought down from the heavens by the ancient fathers. But he could also see the executioner in the foreground, sitting spraddle-legged and calm while he chewed a blade of grass and waited. A squat man with a thick face, he occasionally peered at the thief with empty blue eyes while he casually played mumbledy-peg with the bleeding blade. His stare was blank. "Ready for me yet, Asser?" he grumbled, not unpleasantly. The knife man sat beyond spitting range, but Asser spat and tried to wipe his chin on the post. "Your dirty mother," he mumbled. The executioner chuckled and played mumbledy-peg. After 3 hours of dangling from the spikes that pierced his arms, Asir was weakening, and the blood throbbed hard in his temples, with each jolt of his heart a separate pulse of pain. The red stickiness had stopped oozing down his arms. They knew how to drive the spikes just right. But the heartbeats labored in his head like a hammer beating at red-hot iron. How many heartbeats in a lifetime? And how many left to him now? He whimpered and writhed, beginning to lose all hope. Mara had gone to see the chief commoner, to plead with him for the pilferer's life. But Mara was about as trustworthy as a wild huffin, and he had visions of them chuckling together in Tolka's villa over a glass of amber wine while life slowly drained from the young thief. Asir regretted nothing. His father had been a renegade before him, had squandered his last ritual formula to buy a wife, then impoverished, had taken her away to the hills. Asser was born in the hills, but he came back to the village of his ancestors to work as a servant and steal the rituals of his masters. No thief could last for long. A ritual thief caused havoc in the community. The owner of a holy phrase, not knowing that it had been stolen, tried to spend it, and eventually counterclaims would come to light and a general accounting had to be called. The thief was always found out. Asser had stolen more than wealth. He had stolen the strength of their souls. For this, they hung him by his wrists and waited for him to beg for the bleeding blade. Woman thirsts for husband, man thirsts for wife, baby thirsts for breast milk, thief thirsts for knife. A rhyme from his childhood, a childish chant, an eeny, meeny, miny for determining who should drink first from a nectar cactus. He groaned and tried to shift his weight more comfortably. Where was Mara? "Ready for me yet, Asser?" the squat man asked. Asser hated him with narrowed eyes. The executioner was bound by law to wait until his victim requested his fate, but Asser remained ignorant of what the fate would be. The counselor of senior kinsmen judged him in secret and passed a sentence as to what the executioner should do with the knife. But Asser was not informed of their judgment. He knew only that when he asked for it, the executioner would advance with the bleeding blade and extract the punishment, his life or an amputation, depending on the judgment. He might lose only an eye or an ear or a finger. But on the other hand, he might lose his life, both arms, or his masculinity. There was no way to find out until he asked for the punishment. If he refused to ask, they would leave him hanging there. In theory, a thief could escape by hanging 4 days, after which the executioner would pull out the nails. Sometimes a culprit managed it, but when the nails were pulled, the thing that toppled was already a corpse. The sun was sinking in the west, and it blinded him. Asir knew about the sun, knew things the stupid council failed to know. A thief, if successful, frequently became endowed with wisdom, for he memorized more wealth than a score of honest men. Quotations from the ancient gods, Fermi, Einstein, Eigerman, Hanser, and the rest. Most men owned scattered phrases, and scattered phrases remain meaningless. But a thief memorized all transactions he overheard, and the countless phrases could be fitted together into meaningful ideas. He knew now that Mars, once dead, was dying again, its air leaking away once more into space, and man would die with it unless something were done, and done quickly. The blaze of the great wind needed to be rekindled under the earth, but it would not be done. The tribes had fallen into ignorance, even as the holy books had warned. It is realized that the colonists will be unable to maintain a technology without basic tools, and that a rebuilding will require several generations of intelligently directed effort. Given the knowledge, the colonists may be able to restore a machine culture if the knowledge continues to be bolstered by desire. But if the third, fourth, and nth generations fail to further the gradual retooling process, the knowledge will become worthless. The quotation was from the god Rogan's Progress of the Mars Culture, and he had stolen bits of it from various sources. The books themselves were no longer in existence, remembered only in memorized ritual chants, the possession of which meant wealth. Asser was sick. Pain and slow loss of blood made him weak, and his vision blurred. He failed to see her coming until he heard her feet rustling in the grass. Mara, she smirked and spat contemptuously at the foot of the post. The daughter of a senior kinsman, she was a tall, slender girl with an arrogant strut and mocking eyes. She stood for a moment with folded arms, eyeing him with amusement. Then, slowly, one eye closed in a solemn wink. She turned her back on him and spoke to the executioner. May I taunt the prisoner, Slubbill? She asked. It's forbidden to speak to the thief, growled the knifesman. Is he ready to beg for justice, Slubbill? The knifeman grinned and looked at Asser. Are you ready for me yet, thief? Asser hissed an insult. The girl had betrayed him. Evidently a coward, she said. Perhaps he means to hang 4 days. Let him then. No, I think that I should like to see him beg. She gave Asir a long searching glance, then turned to walk away. The thief cursed her quietly and followed her with his eyes. A dozen steps away, she stopped again, looked back over her shoulder, and repeated the slow wink. Then she marched on toward her father's house. The wink made his scalp crawl for a moment, but then, suppose she hasn't betrayed me. Suppose she had wheedled the sentence out of Tokra and knew what his punishment would be. I think that I should like to see him beg. But on the other hand, the fickle she-devil might be tricking him into asking for a sentence that she knew would be death or dismemberment, just to amuse herself. He cursed inwardly and trembled as he peered at the bored executioner. He licked his lips and fought against dizziness as he groped for words. Slubble heard him muttering and looked up. Are you ready for me yet? Asir closed his eyes and gritted his teeth. Give it to me, he yelped suddenly and braced himself against the post. Why not? The short time gained couldn't be classed as living. Have done with it. Eternity would be sweet in comparison with this ignominy. A knife could be a blessing. He heard the executioner chuckle and stand up. He heard the man's footsteps approaching slowly and the singing hiss of the knife as Slubble swung it in a quick arc. The executioner moved about him slowly, teasing him with the whistle of the steel fanning the air about him. He was expected to beg. Slubble occasionally laid the knife against his skin and took it away again. Then Aesir heard the rustle of the executioner's cloak as his arms went back. Aesir opened his eyes. The executioner grinned as he held the blade high, aimed at Aesir's head. The girl had tricked him. He groaned and closed his eyes again, muttering a half-forgotten prayer. The stroke fell, and the blade chopped into the post above his head. Aesir fainted. When he awoke, he lay in a crumpled heap on the ground. The executioner rolled him over with his foot. In view of your extreme youth, thief, the knife man growled, the council has ordered you perpetually banished. The sun is setting. Let dawn find you in the hills. If you return to the plains, you'll be chained to a wild huffin and dragged to death. Panting weakly, Aesir groped at his forehead and found a fresh wound, raw and rubbed with rust to make a scar. Slubble had marked him as an outcast. But except for the nail holes through his forearms, he was still in one piece. His hands were numb, and he could scarcely move his fingers. Slubble had bound the spike wounds, but the bandages were bloody and leaking. When the knife man had gone, Aesir climbed weakly to his feet. Several of the townspeople stood nearby, snickering at him. He ignored their catcalls and staggered toward the outskirts of the village 10 minutes away. He had to speak to Mara and to her father if the crusty oldster would listen. His thief's knowledge weighed upon him and brought desperate fear. Darkness had fallen by the time he came to Welkir's house. The people spat at him in the streets, and some of them flung handfuls of loose dirt after him as he passed. A light flickered feebly through Welkir's door. Aesir rattled it and waited. Welkir came with a lamp. He set the lamp on the floor and stood with his feet spread apart, arms folded, glaring haughtily at the thief. His face was stiff as weathered stone. He said nothing, but only stared contemptuously. Aesir bowed his head. I've come to plead with you, senior kinsman. Welkir snorted disgust. Against the mercy we have shown you? He looked up quickly, shaking his head. No, for that I'm grateful. What then? As a thief, I acquire much wisdom. I know that the world is dying, and the air is boiling out of it into the sky. I wish to be heard by the council. We must study the words of the ancients and perform their magic, lest our children's children be born to strangle in a dead world. Welkir snorted again. He picked up the lamp. He who listens to a thief's wisdom is cursed. He who acts upon it is doubly cursed and a party to the crime. The vaults, Aesir insisted. The key to the blaze of winds is in the vaults. The god Roggins tells us in the words, stop, I will not hear. Very well, but the blaze can be rekindled and the air renewed. The vaults, he stammered and shook his head. The council must hear me. The council will hear nothing, and you shall be gone before dawn. And the vaults are guarded by the sleeper called Big Joe. To enter is to die. Now go away. Welkir stepped back and slammed the door. Aesir sagged in defeat. He sank down on the doorpost to rest a moment. The night was black except for lamp flickers from an occasional window. St! A sound from the shadows. He looked around quickly, searching for the source. St! Aesir! It was the girl, Mara, Welkir's daughter. She had slipped out the back of the house and was peering at him around the corner. He arose quietly and went to her. What did Slubble do to you? She whispered. Aesir gasped and caught her shoulders angrily. Don't you know? No, stop, you're hurting me. Takara wouldn't tell me. I made love to him, but he wouldn't tell. He released her with an angry curse. You had to take it sometime, she hissed. I knew if you waited, you would be too weak from hanging to even run away. He called her a foul name. Ingrate, she snapped, and I bought you a hoofen. You what? Takra gave me a ritual phrase and I bought you a hoofen with it. But you can't walk to the hills, you know. Aesir burned with full rage. You slept with Takra, he snapped. You're jealous, she tittered. How can I be jealous? I hate the sight of you. Very well then, I'll keep the hoofen. Do, he growled. I won't need it since I'm not going to the hills. She gasped. You've got to go, you fool. They'll kill you. He turned away, feeling sick. She caught at his arm and tried to pull him back. Aesir, take the hoofen and go. I'll go, he growled, but not to the hills. I'm going out to the vault. He stalked away, but she trotted along beside him, trying to tug him back. Fool, the vaults are sacred. The priests guard the entrance, and the sleeper guards the inner door. They'll kill you if you try it, and if you linger, the council will kill you tomorrow. Let them, he snarled. I'm no sniveling townsman. I'm of the hills, and my father was a renegade. Your council had no right to judge me. Now I shall judge them. The words were spoken hotly, and he realized their folly. He expected a scornful rebuke from Mara, but she hung on to his arm and pleaded with him. He had dragged her a dozen doorways from the house of her father. Her voice had lost its lilt of arrogance and became pleading. Please, Asir, go away. Listen, I will even go with you if you want me. He laughed harshly. Tokra's leavings. She slapped him hard across the mouth. Takra is an impotent old dodderer. He can scarcely move for arthritis. You're an idiot. I sat on his lap and kissed his bald pate for you. Then why did he give you a ritual phrase? He asked stiffly. Because he likes me. You lie, he stalked angrily on. Very well. Go to the vaults. I'll tell my father, and they'll hunt you down before you get there. She released his arm and stopped. Asir hesitated. She meant it. He came back to her slowly, then slipped his swollen hands to her throat. She did not back away. Why don't I just choke you and leave you lying here? He hissed. Her face was only a shadow in darkness, but he could see her cool smirk. Because you love me, Asir of Frannic. He dropped his hands and grunted a low curse. She laughed low and took his arm. Come on, we'll go get the Hoofen. Why not, he thought. Take her Hoofen and take her too. He could dump her a few miles from the village, then circle back to the vaults. She leaned against him as they moved back toward her father's house, then skirted it and stole back to the fields behind the row of dwellings. Phobos hung low in the west, its tiny disk lending only a faint glow to the darkness. He heard the Hoofen's breathing as they approached a hulking shadow in the gloom. Its great wings snaked out slowly as it sensed their approach, and it made a low piping sound. A native Martian species, it bore no resemblance to the beasts the ancients had brought with them from the sky. Its back was covered with a thin shell like a beetle's, but its belly was porous and soft. It digested food by sitting on it and absorbing it. The wings were bony, parchment stretched across a fragile frame. It was headless and lacked a centralized brain, the nervous functions being distributed. The great creature made no protest as they climbed up the broad flat back and strapped themselves down with belts that had been threaded through holes cut in the Hoofen's skin and tough shell. Its lungs slowly gathered a tremendous breath of air, causing the riders to rise up as the huge air sacs became distended. The girth of an inflated Hoofen was nearly 4 times as great as when deflated. When the air was gathered, the creature began to shrink again as its muscles tightened, compressing the breath until a faint leakage hiss came from behind. It waited, wings taut. The girl tugged at a ring set through the flesh of its flank. There was a blast of sound and a jerk. Nature's experiment in jet propulsion soared ahead and turned into the wind. Its first breath exhausted, it gathered another and blew itself ahead again. The ride was jerky. Each tailward belch was a rough lurch. They let the Hoofen choose its own heading as it gained altitude. Then Mara tugged at the wing straps, and the creature wheeled to soar toward the dark hills in the distance. Asir sat behind her, a sardonic smirk on his face as the wind whipped about them. He waited until they had flown beyond screaming distance of the village. Then he took her shoulders lightly in his hands. Mistaking it for affection, she leaned back against him easily and rested her dark head on his shoulder. He kissed her, while his hand felt gingerly for the knife at her belt. His fingers were numb, but he managed to clutch it and press the blade lightly against her throat. She gasped. With his other hand, he caught her hair. Now guide the Hoofen down, he ordered. Asir, quickly, he barked. What are you going to do? Leave you here and circle back to the vaults. No, not out here at night. He hesitated. There were slinking prowlers on the Cimmerian plain, beasts who would regard a marooned daughter of Welkir as a delicious bit of good fortune, a gustatory delight of a sort they seldom were able to enjoy. Even above the moan of the wind, he could hear an occasional howl cry from the fanged welcoming committee that waited for its dinner beneath them. Very well, he growled reluctantly. Turn toward the vaults, but one scream and I'll slice you. He took the blade from her throat, but kept the point touching her back. Please, Aesir, no, she pleaded. Let me go on to the hills. Why do you want to go to the vaults? Because of Takra? He gouged her with a point until she yelped. Takra be damned, and you with him, he snarled. Turn back. Why? I'm going down to kindle the blaze of winds. You're mad. The spirits of the ancients live in the vaults. I am going to kindle the blaze of winds, he insisted. Now either turn back or go down, and I'll go back alone. After a hesitant moment, she tugged at a wing rein, and the hoofen banked majestically. They flew a mile to the south of the village, then beyond it toward the cloister where the priests of Big Joe guarded the entrance to the vaults. The cloister was marked by a patch of faint light on the ground ahead. Circle around it once, he ordered. You can't get in, they'll kill you. He doubted it. No one ever tried to enter except the priests who carried small animals down as sacrifices to the great sleeper. Since no outsider ever dared go near the shaft, the guards expected no one. He doubted they would be alert. The cloister was a hollow square with a small stone tower rising in the center of the courtyard. The tower contained the entrance to the shaft. In the dim light of Phobos, assisted by yellow flickers from the cloister windows, he peered at the courtyard as they circled closer. It seemed to be empty. Land by the tower, he ordered. Asir, please do it. The hoofen plunged rapidly, soaring across the outer walls, and burst into the courtyard. It landed with a rough jolt and began squeaking plaintively. Hurry, he hissed. Get your straps off and let's go. I'm not going. A prick of the knife point changed her mind. They slid quickly to the ground, and Asir kicked the hoofen in the flanks. The beast sucked in air and burst aloft. Startled faces were trying to peer through the lighted cloister windows into the courtyard. Someone cried a challenge. Asir darted to the door of the tower and dragged it open. Now forced to share the danger, the girl came with him without urging. They stepped into its stair landing. A candle flickered from a wall bracket. A guard sitting on the floor beneath the candle glanced up in complete surprise. Then he reached for a short barbed pike. Asir kicked him hard in the temple, then rolled his limp form outside. Men with torches were running across the courtyard. He slammed the heavy metal door and bolted it. Fists began beating on the door. They paused for a moment to rest, and Mara stared at him in fright. He expected her to burst into angry speech, but she only leaned against the wall and panted. The dark mouth of the stairway yawned at them, a stone throat that led into the bowels of Mars and the realm of the monster Big Joe. He glanced at Mara thoughtfully and felt sorry for her. I can leave you here, he offered, but I'll have to tie you. She moistened her lips, glanced first at the stairs, then at the door where the guards were raising a frantic howl. She shook her head. I'll go with you. The priests won't bother you if they see you were a prisoner. I'll go with you. He was pleased, but angry with himself for the pleasure. An arrogant, spiteful, conniving wench, he told himself. She'd lied about Takra. He grunted gruffly, seized the candle, and started down the stairs. When she started after him, he stiffened and glanced back, remembering the barbed pike. As he had suspected, she had picked it up. The point was a foot from the small of his back. They stared at each other, and she wore her self-assured smirk. Here, she said, and handled it casually. You might need this. They stared at each other again, but it was different this time. Bewildered, he shook his head and resumed the descent toward the vaults. The guards were battering at the doors behind them. The stairwell was damp and cold. Blackness folded about them like a shroud. They moved in silence, and after 5,000 steps, Asir stopped counting. Somewhere in the depths, Big Joe slept his restless sleep. Asir wondered grimly how long it would take the guards to tear down the metal door. Somehow they had to get past Big Joe before the guards came thundering after them. There was a way to get around the monster, of that he was certain. A series of 24 numbers was involved, and he had memorized them with a stolen bit of ritual. How to use them was a different matter. He imagined vaguely one must call them out in a loud voice before the inner entrance. The girl walked beside him now, and he could feel her shivering. His eyes were quick and nervous as he scanned each pool of darkness, each nook and cranny along the stairway wall. The well was silent except for the mutter of their footsteps, and the gloom was full of musty odors. The candle afforded little light. I told you the truth about Tokra, she blurted suddenly. Asher glowered straight ahead and said nothing, embarrassed by his previous jealousy. They moved on in silence. Suddenly she stopped. Look, she hissed, pointing down ahead. He shielded the candle with his hand and peered downward toward a small square of dim light. The bottom of the stairs, he muttered. The light seemed faint and diffuse, with a slight greenish cast. Asser blew out the candle, and the girl quickly protested. How will we see to climb again? He laughed humorlessly. What makes you think we will? She moaned and clutched at his arm, but came with him as he descended slowly toward the light. The stairway opened into a long corridor whose ceiling was faintly luminous. White-faced and frightened, they paused on the bottom step and looked down the corridor. Mara gasped and covered her eyes. Big Joe, she whispered in awe. He stared through the stairwell door and down the corridor through another door into a large room. Big Joe sat in the center of the room, sleeping his sleep of ages amid a heap of broken and whitening bones. A creature of metal, twice the height of Asir, he had obviously been designed to kill. Tri-fingered hands with gleaming talons and a monstrous head shaped like a Mars wolf with long silver fangs. Why should a metal creature have fangs unless he had been built to kill? The behemoth slept in a crouch, waiting for the intruders. He tugged the girl through the stairwell door. A voice droned out of nowhere. If you have come to plunder, go back. He stiffened, looking around. The girl whimpered. Stay here by the stairs, he told her, and pushed her firmly back through the door. Asir started slowly toward the room where Big Joe waited. Beyond the room, he could see another door, and the monster's job was apparently to keep intruders back from the inner vaults, where, according to the ritual chants, the blaze of the winds could be kindled. Halfway along the corridor, the voice called out again, beginning a kind of sing-song chant. Big Joe will kill you, Big Joe will kill you, Big Joe will kill you. He turned slowly, searching for the speaker, but the voice seemed to come from a blank disc on the wall. The talking machine, perhaps, mentioned somewhere in the ritual. A few paces from the entrance to the room, the voice fell silent. He stopped at the door, staring at the monster. Then he took a deep breath and began chanting the 24 numbers in a loud but quavering voice. Big Joe remained in his motionless crouch. Nothing happened. He stepped through the doorway. Big Joe emitted a deafening roar, straightened with a metallic groan, and lumbered toward him, taloned hands extended and eyes blazing furiously. Asir shrieked and ran for his life. Then he saw Mara lying sprawled in the doorway entrance. She had fainted. Blocking an impulse to leap over her and flee alone, he stopped to lift her. But suddenly he realized there was no pursuit. He looked back. Big Joe had returned to his former position, and he appeared to be asleep again. Puzzled, Asir stepped back into the corridor. If you have come to plunder, go back. He moved gingerly ahead again. Big Joe will kill you, Big Joe will kill you, Big Joe will kill. He recovered the barbed spike from the floor and stole into the zone of silence. This time he stopped to look around. Slowly, he reached the pike staff through the doorway. Nothing happened. He stepped closer and waved it around inside. Big Joe remained motionless. Then he dropped the point of the spike to the floor. The monster bellowed and started to rise. Asir leaped back, scalp crawling. But Big Joe settled back in his crouch. So our hero has discovered a puzzle, and we'll see if he solves it next time.